you. Well, welcome. I'm Lyn Boyd-Judson with the Levan Institute for Humanities and Ethics. Ron, thank you for coming and offering. Appreciate it. This was a beautiful, beautiful film. May I, before I get started with kind of a bit of a conversation and then a Q&A, can you let me know how many of you here are affiliated with the School of Cinema? You say? And how many are here from Dornsife, from the college? Okay, I'm not sure. Then we have a lot of community members. My hope with any of these sorts of conversations is that the conversation is going to be between ultimately the audience and Ron. And I'm here to facilitate that by starting us with some questions. Mine are going to be on humanities and ethics because it's what I do. I realized when I watched this film the second time that I have questions about women in Hillex. Is it Hillex, Ron? That I did not bring. I did bring a few questions I had prepared beforehand. So I hope the audience is going to ask those. If you don't, I'm going to come back around because I had new ones. But I'm going to start with what I wanted to bring up. Now, before I do that, Ron, would you like to make some opening remarks about Kent?
Yes, Lyn, thank you. And thank you for being here. My dear friend Kent would be very pleased after all these over 60 years for people to come to see this film. I assume I have low vision, so I couldn't see. There are some cinema students here. Yes, so let me first just say a little bit about the film and the problems we faced in making the film. I don't want to linger on that, so if you want to talk with me afterwards a bit about that, I'll be happy to do so. I'm no fan of the auteur theory of filmmaking, but this was the work of one remarkable man who died much too young, Kent Mackenzie. He never lived to see the acclaim. We got wonderful reviews when the film came out, but it never got much of a distribution, so he never saw this later acclaim that it received. But it was his vision, and the rest of us were really just privileged to help him make this film. The other, as Gabriel mentioned, the inspiration of the film was really the remarkable, wonderful French film director, Jean Renoir. As Gabe said, Kent snuck me into his master class here at USC, I think it was 1955. And what Renoir, the son of the great Pierre Renoir, the painter, and really the one of the pioneers of modern film in that he brought a humanist, realist approach to films, not just in acting style, but also in his depth of field direction, getting away from the proscenium, those who are film students. Renoir was really the great innovator. But what he inspired in us young Americans at that time, in the first place, he warned us against what he considered to be the American predilection of being much too concerned with technique and its perfection. He also warned us not to become careerists in Hollywood, but at least we paid attention to the first admonition. But the main thing he wanted to say to us, this was at USC, is don't look for fanciful stories. Renoir, who had fled France when the Germans took it over, was living in the United States during the war. He knew LA, and he was fascinated by it. And he said, there is such a reality out there in those streets. He said, just step outside. Now, still USC abuts downtown Los Angeles, and that's what Kent did. I think maybe the following year, Kent made his remarkable short film, Bunker Hill, about the demolition of that wonderful little collection of Victorian homes that were destroyed immediately, and about the senior citizens who were living there. And in a way, Bunker Hill, that short film, was really kind of a trial run for the Exiles, because not only did Kent follow Renoir's example of how to deal with real people, and I think it was a touch of genius on Kent's part, that he got these people to do the most impossible thing to do in films, and that is to be yourself in front of the camera. And I don't know really how he did it, but that was the inspiration of Renoir. And also, I think you can see in his film about the demolition of the Bunker Hill community, Kent's concern with the loss of community, which is, I think, thematic to the Exiles. As far as the film techniques are concerned, I think most of the professionals at that time thought we were crazy. There were handheld cameras we could have used. I mean, in those crowded bars, there was hardly room for the crew to be in. Because you have to understand, this was an interchange between reality and the filming. There was no dialogue. We were never quite sure what was going to happen. Kent would suggest certain things, but even that fight in the bar was a real fight. If you see the guy's hair jumps up, and that's not faking it, you know. So we were playing with reality, and what would have made much more sense would for us to have been using handheld 16 millimeter cameras, but they had a very short load at that time, and for whatever reason, Kent decided to shoot it on 35 millimeter. Well, that meant we had a 35 millimeter Mitchell camera on a tripod and even laying track. Yeah, that was crazy. In that little bar, there was hardly room for anybody. The crew was very small. The sound man, Kent, two cameramen, and an AD. And I was often the AD. I'm credited in one version of the credits as being a co-producer. I don't quite know that what means. As you can see, there were so many people involved. I was the assistant director on some of the major sequences, including the sequence on in the reservation and that rather wild night on Hillex. I don't know if you would call me AD or ringmaster in that, but the other unsung heroes of Exiles were the lab guys. This was 35 millimeter film. It was very slow, much slower than color film was in a few years after that. So to be able to get it light sensitive, they really pushed the film. And that was not only important to be able to see it, but to be able to put down the f-stop so you could get depth of focus. Now, with your new technology, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but that allowed us to get depth of focus, which was very important. But the most important thing I would just want to say to conclude about the filmmaking is that what Kent learned from Renoir is the art of film is the human face and eyes. And I think you can see that, the humanity in these people. How he did, I can't tell you, but it was his accomplishment.
Thank you. You know, I had an interesting read before coming to visit with you tonight because I actually looked through Kent's thesis for the film school here at USC, and he was talking a bit about the 2 years he spent with the stars of this film, and that Tommy for 2 years with his best friend, and all the evenings he spent drinking with them out in front of the Ritz, to where he almost felt part of the community before he had to realize he was making it too easy to think he was part of their community. It was a fascinating read to see a bit. I went there, Ron, because I was trying to see how this film is about poverty, which is what we decided to call the evening's discussion. And when we watched it, I thought, is this film about poverty? I didn't expect how it turned out. I had a different idea of what we would be discussing when I walked into this. I looked at some of the things you wrote. I looked at Kent's thesis, and the language is more. I know you've used the phrase poverty of identity. Kent used the phrase the endurance of poverty, not the glamorization of poverty, but just the daily endurance of it. Can you say a little about that? What was poverty a point of what you were trying to do?
No, it really wasn't. And I should say also, the film, Kent was fascinated and very respectful of what we now call Native American culture, but it wasn't about that. I think what made him and the rest of us, white guys trying to be filmmakers, uh, what motivated the film was our identity as exiles. Uh, the 50s, um, we were called a silent generation. That was somewhat true, but it was somewhat misleading. Those of us that grew up in the 50s already had the disquiet and sense of being exiles and of alienation that became apparent in the 60s later. You can see that in the culture of the time. If you look at the plays of Beckett or Arthur Miller, or the writings of David Reisman or Octavio Paz, the sense of alienation, which Nietzsche and others had predicted, was very evident after the war. There was this very brief period of prosperity and renewal after the World War II, but it lasted very shortly. we felt that we were exiles also. We were also displaced people, even though we were white middle-class guys. That, I think, was the closest that we had to an approach of what we meant by poverty. I grew up in a poor family in the Great Depression. We had no money. And I never went hungry, but I had cardboard in my shoes because we couldn't provide that. And yet I never experienced any sense of inferiority or shame or resentment because I had family, I had community, I had identity. And that is what's missing in what we now call poverty. So poverty, I think, in our own time needs to be redefined in terms of not just economic problems, but the loss of basic relationships and the loss of community. I can say more about that, but I think that's what Kant had sensed in making Bunker Hill and what he sensed in what had happened to these young Native Americans. And I think it's evident in their narration, their sense of the loss of no longer really having an identity and belonging to a people.
And you've worked with groups here in Los Angeles after your making of this film on the issue of poverty. Have you not? Am I understanding that correctly? Can you speak to that a little bit, the kind of arc of the decade since then in current day Los Angeles? What have you seen?
Well, it just affirmed, yes, I retired early from show business after a lifetime in show business. And I worked as both a, I guess you'd say, social worker and a chaplain for about 20 years in Los Angeles with street people and in the prisons, in prison ministry. And it just affirmed what I found is that even if someone had a chance to get out of economic poverty, unless they had the basic relationship, some fundamental relationship, something with family, something with community, and something with hope, they were going to remain, they were going to go back to the substitutes for those things, which were often drugs and alcohol, as we saw here. Hasn't changed. It hadn't changed a lot. I did that for 20 years in Los Angeles, yeah.
This is a segue into a quote I want to read before I start to take some comments and questions from the audience. And this is from Kent's thesis, and it's very close to what you're saying, Ron. He said, "As I began to absorb the details of their lives, I was puzzled as how to communicate the whole totality. The more I saw of them, the more I felt there was no pat answer to their problems. There were no simple practical solutions such as giving them jobs, sending them back to their reservations, or putting them in jail. Their problem was an inner problem, so was how to film it." I thought that was a very descriptive of what we just saw on screen. Um, and the idea of this as an inner problem is not what social scientists might say, or from even my field, where we would come to it. There's almost a sense of a spiritual poverty, if I may, or some sense of that
Yes,
you speak of as
certainly call it
community.
that, yeah.
Okay.
And I think that points to the role of artists, those of you who want to make films and write and poetry and everything like that. I think that will be the field that we will need to explore this because it is a holistic one. What we're calling poverty in America now is not measurable in economic terms. It isn't inner, however we want to describe it, spiritually or inwardly. And that, I think, is going to require imagination more than social measurement, as valuable as that will be later, for us to understand what the possible answer might be to that.
Thank you. Is that thought provoking for anyone out here? Do you have questions or comments for Ron while we have him here? Yes.
I noticed in the mention of the cast was David McDougall, who went on to become a very accomplished ethnographic filmmaker. And so I wondered if you had anything to say about David McDougall's involvement in this project.
He's listed in the cast? Well, I appreciate that. No, I know nothing of him.
He was at UCLA Film School at about that time.
Well, so was I, but I don't remember him from, I don't remember the name of that. And he went on to be a filmmaker.
He's a very, very renowned filmmaker. He lives in Australia now, but He's one of the world's premier ethnographic filmmakers.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. I must confess that I don't know what happened to the principals in this film. It took about 3 years to make the film altogether, including post-production. If I made any particular contribution to this film, it was helping, because I was the only writer in the group, it was helping Kent with the narration later, which took a long time because he had hours and hours of interview and putting it together. But it took so long by the time, I don't think I was ever present at the first screenings of the film. Our lives had just gone in a different way there, so I'm afraid I don't know what happened to any of those people. I know Eric Darstead, who was the principal cinematographer, went on to have a wonderful career, majored cameraman in documentaries, things like that. And John Morrill ended up, as I did many years later, teaching here at USC. But of course, Kent died in his 40s, and we had lost touch by then. Thank you for that.
Ken Nelson was on the film credits.
Ken Nelson.
Oh, yes. I can't see you very well. Do you know Ken?
Yeah, this is Elena talking.
Oh, hi, Elena. Yes, Ken is actually the one that introduced Kent and I. We had a very small group. I was at that other school across the town. But there was a small group of us. This is in the 50s. We were just starting to make documentaries. I produced one of the first, I guess the first police reality show on TV in 1956. And Ken was one of my cameramen on that. And so that's how I actually met Ken. But you can see all that generous list of credits, how many people, and nobody got a cent. The budget of this film, because the camera, I think the equipment came from USC. Post-production was a company that offered it. So the two major things were film stocks and bar bills.
Did anyone have a reaction to the Hillex scene before I asked Ron a question, something I've already read that he said about it? What did you think of that scene? The Hillex,
That's the last scene.
the stomp dance at the top, that was beautiful, looking out over the city of that time period too. Yes.
I thought it was interesting how they felt the need to leave the city to be able to completely allow their tribal culture to consume them. And they were outside of the city.
She said, "Is there a microphone, Gabriel, that maybe we just? I think don't take Ron. You take mine. We'll share one. We'll share one. That way Ron can.
I'm sorry.
Ron can hear the questions if we can get
In
the
addition
microphone.
to poor vision, I have poor hearing as well.
She said she thought it was interesting that they had to leave the city to feel part of their community or to feel separated from where they were.
Incidentally, Hillex is now center field in Dodger Stadium.
Anyone else? Elena?
How the women were always featured as on the outskirts of what was going on, and yet they were always central to. They were in a sense they were the hinges to the story.
The women as the hinges of the story in their way.
Because I felt like the women were sort of holding it together. And,
Not for the first time, yeah.
And on the hill scene as well, because there was I don't know if it was two women or one woman that was being attacked.
It was the one
and then
woman.
And then it sort of instigated the fight, and then the woman brought herself back into the car, and then there was this sort of circling around her, and I just felt like the women were sort of pivotal throughout the film, and of course the woman that was narrating it, but it was sort of interesting to me how the disengagement was always sort of brought about through the men dialogue, but the women were what is sort of central as being figures of the part of the characters that were not, they were the ones that were sort of expressing the identity as not being disengaged, or at least trying not to be disengaged. And
Let me just say, Lyn, that you must remember this was not scripted. Kent didn't make this up. He added little touches, and he cried, and I can give you a couple examples of that, and he guided it. But what Yvonne said, and what Homer said, and what Tommy said, they said. Nobody had written this. So this wasn't an invention, it was a revelation of what was happening.
I want to share something too, Ron. I thought about tonight when I was watching it, and it goes into what you're saying, that I have a Global Women's Narratives project I do through my institute, and some of my students interviewed women in Belfast this past summer when we were there for a course, and they interviewed former combatants who had been prisoners. And it was fascinating to hear the difference between the stories that the men were telling after 20 years in prison and the stories that the women were telling. And one in particular that came to mind, her husband, after he was released, was an alcoholic. She couldn't get him out of a bar with all of his friends, and eventually turned to domestic abuse and set her car on fire in the middle of the square. It was quite publicly humiliating. And she divorced him. And when she talked to my student in her life story about it, she said she felt great empathy for him and for all of the men who had been prisoners because they lost their identity and they couldn't regain it. And she said, women don't seem to have that same problem. It was interesting to think about when I watched this again. She said, we had kids. I drive a taxi. It's not a big deal like it was to the men that they were no longer former IRA combatants. And it struck me. I didn't know how to articulate the women's issue I saw this time around that I hadn't noticed so much the first time.
Well, that was my experience in prison ministry for many years. There was only one institution that, as a chaplain, I dealt with female inmates as well. But it's fundamental. They continue life, and the guys don't. Or they continue life and divorce themselves from what the women don't. So women are the life force. I know that perhaps sounds sentimentalized, but that was my experience. They had a hope of a continuation of life that the guys didn't.
Michael.
I couldn't help thinking that besides identity, the other issue of importance was the question of agency. Who has agency? And so I think that in terms of the women's function, how they play out in the drama, I think that what they do is they cause things to happen, but they don't have agency in and of themselves, is the way it seems. And by the way, that's very much a part of kind of Hollywood filmmaking. It's often been said, it's one of the critiques of feminism in the 70s, was that so much of Hollywood narrative was about women being only the cause of the actions of men, rather than causes in their own right. So I thought, in terms of what was interesting about Hillex, was they recovered agency, because they had something to do that felt meaningful to them. But in the city, in the bars, they were only kind of loitering and being policed. I thought that the shots of the police were so interesting, because
Don't you love that spinning of the nightstick? Oh God, that amazing. Yeah.
was the chief of police at the time, right?
Perhaps just beginning. Yeah. Maybe just before you. Maybe. Yeah.
Very policed, and they're very conscious of it. They've left the reservation, and yet they're still, contained. So that moment on the hill is such a great, recovery of agency, even though they really can't. What you end with is like the day comes, and there's nothing but detritus. There's nothing but, kind of garbage. But that was a moment, and they said, we're going to do it again tonight. We're going to do it again tonight.
Well, I think you picked up on something, Lyn. You said you noticed in the opening narration the phrase ordered freedom, the ordered freedom of their personal life. See, I would add to that the order is community. I think freedom becomes meaningful and expressive in a communal context, not as simply the agency of an isolated person. Now, I think community, which is really what I think this film is about, is what Bunker Hill was about, is the loss of community, and that we Americans have not found a replacement for it as yet. I would say that the word community is probably the most misused word in our contemporary vocabulary. I don't think most Americans even, it's like a white elephant, they don't even know what it is. I experienced community as a kid in a rural community. Community isn't just an association of people. It isn't based on race or ethnicity. That's part of it. But it's a commitment to other people's lives on a depth that I think makes personal freedom then significant. So I think we're kidding ourselves as Americans to think if we have a community. We don't have a community, and that's the great deprivation. That's our shared poverty.
And the phrase, right, the ordered freedom of his own culture was the first sentence in the film, in the narration of the film, with the Native Americans, if you remember that, and the loss of that. And what Ron and I, when I was talking with him about that phrase, it struck me because it sounds like part of the Constitution in some way, doesn't it? And I thought it was such an interesting phrase to use. Besides feeling that there's a 14th Amendment or something constitutional about its citizenship that they're bringing up that's important, or it has echoes of it. It also, again, has a little bit of a religious sensibility. That religion, as we achieve freedom in many religions through kind of ordered steps that we do together somehow. It was just, and I didn't know what to make of the phrase, but I thought it was thought provoking to open the film in that way.
Whether you use the term religion, I think, which is quite legitimate, or transcendent hope. In other words, a hope that resides in other people's lives as well as your own. I think that's at the essence of it, yes.
Someone, yes, sir, in the back.
You know, that scene on the hill, to me, that was a fabulous scene. That, to me, captured the whole essence of, they were Native Americans. That was the powwow, that was the drum, that was the dance, that was the singing, that was the community that they were looking for. You know, and I think the director, you know, he caught that. He caught that really well there. And whoever did the sound on that, too, I thought did a fabulous job. But I wasn't too sure what I was going to see tonight and everything, looking at the trailer. But, you know, the documentary really, I think, came through. It was really a fabulous documentary.
Thank you for that. For the filmmakers, I wanted to say a little something about what Kent did and what Kent did. We just helped him. In terms of the reality of that scene, and it was real. That is what they did every Saturday night. We didn't invent it. And I'll tell you, it was so real that we had to take 2 guys to the emergency hospital. So, you know, that was a very raw realism. But what Kent was able to do, and I say this to the filmmakers, he was able to add little moments. There's only one slightly fake thing in that, is that the fight that actually starts, if you see one guy's do a couple of flips, those were Native American stuntmen that were working in movies. After that, it was a real fight, but we actually had them to get it started. But if you notice, when Ursula Ann, has been brutalized by Tommy, or at least he hits her, and she starts to walk away, Kent actually suggested to Homer that he give her the blanket. Homer was already reacting with sympathy. And you can see that in Homer's reaction. But it was just Kent's genius was to find little moments to just very quietly, nobody ever spoke to them except him. None of us ever gave any suggestion or even much of interaction with the principals. But Kent would make these, I would say, augmenting moments of reality. That's a real skill for you filmmakers.
Yes, I should preface by saying that I teach a general education seminar on Native American literature. I've been teaching ceremony by Leslie Silko most recently, And I really appreciate this movie. Like the person who spoke before me, I was not sure what I would see, and so I had to confess a little bit of, you know, um, suspicions, because as we know, one of the long-standing myths is that of the vanishing Indians that has dominated culture, especially in those years. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that the director was able to capture the resilience of native cultures, the survival spirit that is so evident in the concluding scene, because I agree, they are able to put together a ceremony that is communal, however imperfect, because there is the fighting and the violence against the women, but it is, in a sense, an attempt to not to just succumb to their own solitary desperation, so to speak. So, very grateful for that. I invited my students, but hey, it's Thursday night. And I think I learned from them that it is, what do they call it, Thirsty Thursday or whatever.
You mean they're in a bar someplace? Okay, well, that's good. Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to state, I mean, I had many thoughts, but one in particular was the scene on the hill. Two things automatically, like I sort of went like this because it's like they came alive. They were alive at that moment. And at the end, the scene of the trash. I had spent time with the First Nation communities in Oklahoma, and I was at one of their drum circles that went late into the night, and I was one of the last people to leave. And I was shocked at the trash. And it was just such a, sort of that difference of culture that's become a part of their society, that at one time, like, we tend to see their society as an example of returning to nature, returning to that respect of true nature. And yet there's been that loss to where, you know, the modern US culture of trash being left. So it was just interesting because it brought me back to Oklahoma late at night at the end of the drum circle with the trash.
Thank you. I don't know how to interpret that, but that's a very, very interesting.
Could we also talk a little bit about the scene in the bar with the also the gay men in the bar too? Because I think there's the gender divisions and you know, women with women and men socializing with men, and we've talked about that. But it was interesting to see how these bars were also heavily policed, heavily watched, sort of marginal spaces in some ways, but also subaltern spaces. And I just thought that it was interesting that perhaps, you know, to see that the sole sort of white person who wasn't a policeman being also a gay man you know, being in this space as well. And you got a sense that that was also one of the sources of tension for that bar fight. And so I was just curious to hear your thoughts about that, or if you had any insight into how that played in.
Yes, well, first let me correct one thing. The policing was not heavy until after 2 o'clock. Uh, I don't remember, and we spent many nights there. I don't remember a police presence until the very end of the evening, and that was usually when people were just staggering into the street, you know. But the bars, someone asked me earlier, one of the students here, about whether there had been, there apparently was a Latino bar somewhere there too. I wasn't aware of it. But all of the bars were heavily, did you use the term balkanized? They were self-segregated. The Ritz and the Columbine, you were not welcome unless you were what they then called themselves Indians. That was it. And the gay guy was there because he was selling himself. We didn't invent that. He was a gay hustler. And yes, I think you're right. And again, Kent did not invent this any more than he invented, well, I must confess, we allowed the fight to take place between those two guys. But Homer and that guy in the cap had been after each other for some time. We knew it was bound to happen. But I think that night, that white gay guy was there because that's what he was doing. But he was not really welcome. The only reason was there because of the services that he was providing. But it was highly segregated. And I think it was probably with other ethnicities and races as well.
Yes, sir.
I have sort of a statement and a question at the end. You brought back the Thunderbird, which is the cheapest drink you could get at that time. The old cars were great, the Angel's Flight. When I went to school here, we shot that in one of our films. I loved all that stuff from the past. You showed the lights of the city that are now more plentiful than they were then. But here's what I felt. The Indians became firewater, and they drank, and it destroyed, to me, watching that, the culture of the Indians. And my question is, was that dubbed? A lot of that stuff seemed like it was put in later, the dialogue, because it didn't always fit their lips. The sync. Was it dubbed?
It wasn't dubbed, but it wasn't synced.
It wasn't synced,
No,
but it wasn't dubbed.
no.
So you just put that in, you heard them talk.
It was what we call wild track.
Okay. But it was a beautiful film. It was not what I expected.
Well, and let me clarify again in terms of Kent's intention here. He did not mean this to be a study of Native American culture. As I said at the outset, he identified with the exilic state of isolation and alienation that we were all beginning to identify with there. That's what really the film is about.
What I call a beautiful primitive culture of the Indians. And that's kind of what it felt like to me.
Yes, sir.
I was born in 1940, and I lived not too far from Bunker Hill. And I've experienced everything that those people in the movie were experiencing. The life, the culture, the food, the drama, the lack of this and the lack of that. My dad and I used to shop there at that market.
Grand Central Market.
That Central Market is still there. And I just wanted to kind of let you know that I experienced a lot. That bunker, the little tram that went up and down. My brother and I used to ride up and down till my dad come looking for us.
You could ride it for a nickel. It
Five
had 100 and some odd steps to go up to Bunker Hill, and you could ride that for a nickel, so it was worth it.
Yes, sir.
Bunker Hill was torn down before this movie was made, since so much of it was still in the movie.
He made Bunker Hill in 1956 in anticipation of it being torn down. So I think we were filming this. The film has the date 1961 on it, but we were in post-production, I think, by 1960. So that would have meant that the main film
57, 59 is what I think.
58, 59, yes. And I think it was still pretty much intact then. Although I must tell you, I'm not sure which buildings, I don't remember, this is 65 years ago, I don't remember which of all of those buildings were on Bunker Hill or not. They were in the downtown area.
Well,
Clear which ones were on Main and when you were in the hill in the movie.
It reminds me, though, of another thought, and then I don't have a watch. If Gabriel, you're watching time for us, so people don't feel they need to stay over. The sense of being exiles of a period of time, too. And Homer mentions that. Do you remember that one part? And he's talking a bit about the past 100 years or 200 years, and he wished he had been living in that time. I was born in 1964, so when I read Kent's thesis, it was very much with the idea that I was reading a thesis written in a time period of a young man who just graduated from film school or was in the process. I felt the whole film, seeing the 1950s, it struck me that everyone felt in costume to me who had been cast, if you would say that, who had been the players and the collaborators from the Native American community. I felt quite strongly that I felt like they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I wondered if that was from my sensibility of not being, having lived in the 50s. Is it just that 50s wear appears that way to me? Or did anyone else have that sense of the facial structures, the sense of the look, the power? There was a royalty even in Yvonne's face, I thought, that seemed there was something jarring about it to me to see them in 50s American. Is that okay? So it's not just me. Okay, I just it reminded me of that, and I wondered too when we had talked about feeling an exile from a certain period of time that Kent mentions that in some of his thesis too, that the young filmmakers who were working on this project related to that, that they felt they were maybe not in the right time for what they wanted to be doing and the art they wanted to be making, how much of a struggle that was.
Yes, I think that became more evident in the 60s, in the social rebellion of the 60s. I think in terms of films, I think it's really the filmmakers of the 70s that really capture the deep alienation that we were beginning to film. If you look at the endings of films, which I think are excellent films of that time, of Chinatown and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Midnight Cowboy and The Godmother, and almost everything of Scorsese and Woody Allen, they were finally expressing what we were beginning to feel in the 1950s.
Any last comments or questions? Yes, sir.
In the entirety of the film, there's only one segment that really is not in LA, and that is when the filmmakers decide to take a scene from the reservation. What was the decision behind that for having that scene? Was that to capture a sense of community, this thing that was sought out by the Indian community but was not found in LA?
Well, yes, that was Kent's decision. I would say it was the imagery. I think the elegance of that guy on the horse, the way that he mounts that beautiful horse, tells the whole kind of story in a way. It was more about imagery than content in a way. And so when you come back to Homer, you can see in his face something that he remembers and is missing. But I think Kent was looking for the images rather than any more specific content. Longing, absolutely. I think, and we almost all feel some of that longing too. I mean, it's so beautiful. Yeah. Incidentally, that was filmed in California.
And was that letter scene one of the additions, or did he actually get a letter with the photograph?
I can't tell you. It's quite possible that Kent planted that. That would have been perfectly legitimate. As I say, there were certain things that were, if you want to say contrived. They were, well, why not have Homer give her the blanket and things like that? I'm trying to think of anything. I wanted to conclude, if we're getting close to that. Are you ready for a confession after 50 years?
Yes.
Okay. This is an act of penance. I don't know, and I trust you'll forgive me. And I'm not even quite sure why I'm telling you this, other than to indicate the necessity of imagination in making films. In the film, Yvonne and Homer are expecting a child. And she talks about how she hopes rather, that he might change his life. She's not talking about Homer. The guy she's talking about is Cliff. He's the father of the child, and that's her boyfriend. Cliff is the one, that's why you see we changed the film, because you don't remember Cliff. He's the guy driving the car, the four of them. What happened is that when we saw the film, Homer just took over the movie. I mean, there's something about presence in that guy, and we realized she never used his name. So we changed her husband and boyfriend into Homer in post-production. And none of them ever, I know, complained about it. I don't think they were worried about about the reality of that. So that's a confession after 50.
So that's fascinating. Would you like to close, Gabriel?
Well, I'd like to thank Ron for his absolutely unique insights into this film. So, Ron, thank you so much for sharing with us. I'd also like to thank Lyn Boyd-Judson and the Levan Institute for Humanities and Ethics, our co-sponsor and for discussion, and also Alex Ago, who here at the School of Cinematic Arts has been so instrumental in setting up this evening. So Alex, wherever you are, in whatever projection booth you are currently ensconced, we thank you. A couple of things, there are always announcements, a couple of very quick things. There are tables outside with Ruskin Art Club booklets and flyers. Please take a look at those. We also have membership application forms for those interested in taking advantage of our ongoing calendar of events. And most importantly, I would stress the ongoing discussion and exploration of Ruskin's holistic vision as applied to the challenges of our times that are really at the heart of the club's mission. And our membership chair, Anne, raise your hand, will answer any and all of your questions. Also, please ask Anne or myself, I'll be standing outside, about student membership scholarships that we are offering and membership in the Ruskin Art Club. And you can also apply and pay for membership online at ruskinartclub.com, and there are descriptions there of our calendar of events. There's also a very useful series of resources there on the thought of John Ruskin that we offer. Tonight only, there is a 50% reduction in cost for students